Good morning and good afternoon or good evening to those elsewhere in the world. Thank you for joining us. I know many of you are joining us live and many others will be listening to this in the recorded fashion based on your time zones or your busy work life. I know everybody isn't available precisely at this time. So, my name is Tim Conway. I am the curriculum lead for the industrial control system here at SANS, and I have the pleasure of being joined by two other presenters. And one of my main roles today is to get out of the way. So first, I'm going to introduce Luke Oman from the Mid-Continent ISO, so the Independent System Operator MISO. For 16 years of my career, I worked for an organization that eventually became, as MISO grew, we became a MISO member, and I have very fond memories of working with the organization for over a decade. Great organization. We're all very lucky to have Luke joining us. Luke is a senior advisor focusing on information security, compliance, and risk at MISO, with over 20 years of experience in CIP compliance and technical infrastructure, focused on networking and cybersecurity. So for those of you listening that are interested in CIP 5 and in CIP 7, these are areas that he has worked for a couple of decades on in his job role and work experience. As the NERC CIP standards developed, Luke has been involved in many aspects of the infrastructure and architectures required to meet CIP compliance, and has recently changed roles with responsibility for the technical aspects of information security controls at MISO, focusing on the current, the new, and the changing CIP standards, all of which are very relevant to today's topic and the work that we're doing as a team here. Our second presenter, Peter Brown with Invenergy. While I have not worked directly with Invenergy, I found that over our work careers, our paths have collided many times over the last 15 years, both of us being from Illinois in the Chicago region and working for the same types of utilities and working with the same people for quite some time. Peter has a lengthy career in networking and information technology, focusing on identity management and cybersecurity before transitioning to control system security and making NERC CIP a part of his life for the last 15 years. Since then, he has supported large and small electrical power industry participants in implementing NERC CIP compliance programs and operational technology cybersecurity solutions. His current role is Principal CIP Reliability Compliance with Invenergy, utilizing his 15 years of electric power industry cybersecurity experience and NERC CIP compliance to help his organization with a diverse range of facilities and asset types all around the globe. With both of them and myself, we are not necessarily here from a SANS perspective trying to sell courses. We're not here from an Invenergy trying to sell you clean, reliable power, and we're not here from a MISO perspective trying to get you to join and become MISO members around the world. We are part of a larger group that I will say is easy to think about as a coalition of the willing. As I mentioned in the first webinar, this is sort of a historic trend and thing that you will find across critical infrastructure in many places and spaces around the world, but certainly within the electric power sector and without a doubt throughout North America, where we are all in this together and we are looking at, from an asset owner and operator perspective, things that are going to be challenges for us in how the electric system operations changes over time, the asset mix, or cybersecurity challenges. And we will often create a group to work across peers and many other member perspectives to sort of address what we think needs to be done. And when we achieve that goal, the group goes away and we go work on other things. And this is no different. The Cloud Technology Advisory Group, what we lovingly call the CTAG, as we all like acronyms. Again, think of this as a behind-the-scenes group, nothing official from any region or from NERC. This is a group, again, the coalition of the willing, kind of talking about, and in this particular case, the topic of industrial control systems, cloud integration, and NERC CIP compliance, and sort of the different things that all get entangled in that conversation. This has been modeled after the version 5 of the CIP Standards Transition Advisory Group that was pulled together. As mentioned, it consists of a number of different kind of organization perspectives, whether it's kind of the electric reliability organization, whether it's asset owners and operators, service providers, cloud service providers, educational institutes. Lots of people have joined the CTAG as they see it as a thing that needs to be talked about and addressed. That group is where we're coming from in support of this webinar series. And other members of this group also support more official groups like CITES, the Security Integration and Technology Enablement Subcommittee, and the work they're doing in this space. In addition, kind of all of us looking for cybersecurity assessment methodologies, ways to integrate, not just from a compliance perspective, but from a cybersecurity perspective as well. So that is where we come from the perspective of what we're going to be talking about in this presentation. I have 3 slides that I used in the first of this 6-pack webinar series to just talk about when we say industrial cloud integration, there's a number of things that race through people's mind from a perspective of, are you talking about plant floor? Are you talking about distributed control systems? Are you talking about wide area SCADA, supervisory control and data acquisition? Are you talking about just information in the cloud? And really kind of getting our hands around what it is we're talking about, and specifically when we're looking at this from an electric system perspective in North America, and kind of including in that conversation NERC and CIP, there's all of these things that we have to consider, from operations needs, monitoring and alerting, kind of the data that exists, all the people, process, and technology. It's all in scope. And then you can start peeling apart for your particular organization what things you're pursuing and in what ways. And when we kind of expand that a little further, just the topic of cloud and the various implementations or ways you could pursue it, from kind of traditional on-prem to the left here, moving over to infrastructure as a service, moving over further to platform as a service, and moving over further to software as a service. We talked about this in a little bit more depth in the first webinar, but again, I think in every one of these webinar series, in case somebody's joining for the first time, when someone hears the word cloud, they may have a vision of that. And we're trying to make sure you're considering the various degrees of cloud. And when we're talking about control systems or industrial control integration in the cloud, we're also trying to highlight that you may have certain feelings about doing data about control systems and protected information and sensitive information up in the cloud. So there's certainly a conversation point there on the left end of this slide, kind of data in the cloud and some kind of device provisioning that needs to be done and connected to the cloud to perform it. Moving over and sort of moving further into that space for non-real-time performance. So after the fact analysis, process optimization, unit commitments, forecasting, predictive maintenance, sort of that monitoring and the business optimization pieces that we are seeing a number of organizations within the space moving to cloud-based solution providers. As you move further to the right, you get into the actual kind of performing control from the cloud. And as you start to think about that, considering what types of process environments might that be appropriate for, what other types of areas might it be harder to actually implement from a technical perspective or from a cybersecurity perspective. So again, we talked about these first 3 slides a lot more in the webinar 1. Just wish to highlight them again to highlight those different perspectives that you need to consider when you're thinking about industrial integration and when you're thinking about the word cloud. Now, the last 2 slides I'm going to cover continue on this path of there are multiple perspectives that have to be considered when you're talking about this topic. So if you feel strongly that you shouldn't be pursuing integration into the cloud or connectivity into the cloud, you are probably coming from a perspective, and I would ask you to expand and think about how you're considering cloud, or understand kind of what things may be pursued there. But now further, looking at this topic that the CTAG is focused on of industrial cloud integration and NERC CIP compliance, we took one webinar to sort of kick that all off and set the stage. We're going to have a closing webinar 6 that ties together what people can do today and move forward And in between, we're focusing on these 4 different voices, these 4 different personas, this kind of webinar 1, the asset owner and operator view, the entity itself. Then we're going to move to solution providers who sell solutions to the entities. Then we'll move into the cloud service providers, where as organizations are considering moving in some way, they would be working with various cloud service providers and what are their perspectives on this. And last, we will talk about the compliance concerns and the compliance things that need to be overcome in order to sort of move forward. And for that, we're not necessarily asking a company, an organization, or an entity to step forward and say, here's where we think we have the largest compliance problem, because that will be based on their perspective. We're asking the consultants and the contractors and the people who are working with hundreds of organizations across all of these different perspectives to come in and start highlighting those compliance areas of concern. So again, today, the first perspective we're starting off with is the entity, as ultimately they are the ones responsible for providing and ensuring reliable service across the electric sector. And they're also the ones who will be sitting across the table from an auditor during audit time. When we say the entity, again, we get to put on a different lens and say all entities aren't the same. Some of them are generation only, some are transmission only, some are generation and transmission, some are distribution, some are control center, some are control centers only. So as you think about the different entity types, you have to consider what types of facilities and assets do they own, because that will start to shape their perspective on what they can, could, and should do to benefit their customers, to ensure safe and reliable delivery power. You can consider what types of registered functions they perform throughout NERC, and then ultimately, what does their CIP universe look like? Do they have high impact assets, medium impact? Are they low only? That will help shape their perspectives on this topic. So with that, the remainder of the time, I turn over happily to Peter. Peter will be walking through kind of his entity perspectives and again, kind of decades of involvement in this space. And then Luke will join after that. Any questions that you have along the way, please fill out in the Q&A panel of Zoom. I will do my best to address as many of those as we can. But Peter, if you can try to unmute your microphone and we'll make sure your audio is working.
Thank you, Tim.
Awesome. I'm going to mute mine. And let me know when you would like me to advance. I will handle the slide advancing.
All right. Go ahead with the first slide. So this section of the presentation will focus on the benefits of cloud computing and the challenges of NERC CIP compliance if you are doing cloud computing from the perspective of asset owners, particularly small to medium-sized asset owners. So we're going to be covering what cloud computing is, the advantages, the benefits, the forces driving us towards using cloud solutions, and the challenges, especially from a NERC compliance perspective. Next slide, please. So Tim introduced what cloud computing is. I've included a NIST definition here. Basically, cloud computing is computing infrastructure or services provided and managed by a vendor or a service provider. And cloud computing is always accessible across a network, maybe the internet, maybe a private network, and it can be rapidly provisioned. Those are kind of the key parts of the cloud computing definition that the industry generally works with. And as Tim mentioned, there are sort of subsets of cloud computing, types of cloud services. There's infrastructure as a service, which is basically data centers and computing platforms and networking platforms. And then if you add operating systems or databases on top of that, that's considered platform as a service. And then finally, there's full application solutions, which is generally referred to as software as a service. I think one of the key takeaways from this slide is that this NIST definition is almost 13 years old. So cloud computing has been around for a while. Next slide. Yeah, so the history of cloud computing, much like geologic time, goes back a long time. So cloud computing has its roots in remote submission of computing jobs to timeshare computing systems. And this technology was available in the early 1960s. So, you know, the equivalent in geologic time would be the Proterozoic era. And then moving into the Paleozoic, the term cloud was first applied to network available computing services in the mid-90s. And then in the first 10 years or so of this century, large-scale commercial products from major vendors became available. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, IBM Smart Cloud, Google got into the arena. And then finally moving into the current decade, there's been a rapid growth of cloud computing, both in products available and adoption by the industry. And this has been fueled by the pandemic, but probably the growth would be there even without the pandemic. And the big takeaway from this is that cloud computing is not new. There have been commercial solutions available for 20 years, and the technology is evolved and it's mature. Next slide, please. So what are the advantages of cloud computing that's driving this growth? Pretty obvious and straightforward. There's lower costs. It allows earlier and easier access to new technologies. There's better physical security, at least usually, and especially this is true of smaller organizations. The cloud environment is likely to be much more physically secured than the security that an organization is able to provide on its own premises. There's access to technology that's only available from cloud providers. High performance computing for processing intensive tasks, artificial intelligence. So these are things that are beyond the reach of, again, smaller organizations especially, but are readily available from cloud providers. And then the ability to implement advanced or complicated configuration and customization intensive technologies. I think of Splunk as a good example, without having to have in-house expertise in these technologies. Next slide. So for cloud computing, redundancy and resiliency are built in. Recovery is provided usually, recovery services are usually provided as part of the cloud services. So the customer doesn't have to worry about recovery solutions. And then agility. Cloud solutions can be deployed faster. They can be scaled up or down quickly and without the organizational overhead that happens or has to be overcome if you're deploying these solutions, new solutions, or changing the solutions that you're using within an organization. So, and then support for the software or operating systems, you know, applying patches, applying updates. It's easier for both the vendor providing the solution if they're operating the system themselves, and also for the customer or the consumer of it, because they don't have to do it. And also, it takes the burden of a software vendor, just the burden they have supporting multiple platforms. So if I'm a software solution provider and I'm providing my solutions only by cloud, I don't have to worry about supporting older platforms, multiple operating systems, multiple databases. So I can concentrate on providing the best product possible without worrying about all of the platforms I might need to support. Next slide, please. So organizations are adopting cloud strategies because it makes things easier for them. And some organizations have adopted a strategy of using cloud services exclusively, or at least whenever possible. So that leads to a in-house expertise shift towards cloud solutions and leaves on-premises solutions behind. So organizations that adopt a strategy of using cloud services whenever possible move any system that they can to the cloud, and any system that can't be moved is just left behind. Next slide, please. So this is kind of an illustration of that. You know, we're starting from a point of traditionally running applications on the in-house with hardware and computer racks in a data room. Next slide. So as IT shifts its focus to cloud computing, any application that can move to the cloud is moved to the, you know, better, faster, cheaper solutions that are available in the cloud. Next slide. And that leaves behind anything that can't be moved to the cloud, you know, running on old hardware and not getting the support and focus that the cloud solutions get. Next slide. So all of the advantages of cloud computing that we've been talking about are multiplied for smaller organizations. Products and technologies that are in-house options for larger organizations are only possible as cloud services for small and medium-sized entities. Technologies such as advanced analysis tools that require extensive specialized expertise are only feasible as cloud solutions for smaller enterprises. Next slide. So under the current NERC standards, cloud solutions can be used for systems that support low-impact facilities such as renewable generation, but that's not true for facilities and systems that are classified as medium or high-impact systems. NERC CIP requirements, including CIP 7, CIP 5, CIP 6, make using cloud-based solutions for medium and high impact BES cyber systems or their associated electronic access control and monitoring systems and physical access control systems effectively impossible. Next slide. Until recently, it was also very difficult to allow BES Cyber System Information off premises because of the CIP requirements mandating how BES Cyber System Information is protected. So either from moving it to a simple storage or evidence repository system that was off premises, or using a compliance management tool as a software as a service, or even sending BES Cyber System Information to outside service for analysts analysis was basically made impossible. This meant that using security support systems that are required by NERC CIP, such as anti-malware, vulnerability scanning, asset management, and security information event monitoring, could not be implemented as cloud-based solutions. So there have been recent changes to NERC CIP and to CIP 4 and CIP 11 that make it technically feasible to use cloud services for these systems, but there's still barriers preventing the use of cloud solutions. There's a perceived compliance risk of being an early adopter. People that support NERC CIP compliance would rather see somebody else do it first and see how the auditors respond to it. So that means that using cloud solutions for these CIP required services, if you do choose to be an early adopter, it takes longer to do it because you have to be more careful. Also, if you are using cloud services for different services, you're probably going to be using different vendors, which means more compliance documentation needs to be done. So overall, even though it's possible to use BES Cyber System Information in the cloud, and that opens the door to a lot of to many cloud-based solutions for things like vulnerability scanning, for systems that aren't directly affected by NERC CIP requirements, there's still a barrier in place for doing that. Next slide, please. So the other problem that's happening now is that vendors are withdrawing their on-premises solutions for technologies that are required by NERC CIP. Again, it's the technologies that we've been talking about: electronic access control and monitoring systems, physical access control systems, and then also systems that use BES Cyber Information, security information and event monitoring systems, vulnerability scanning, and anti-malware systems. So here's the next slide, please. So here's an example of the kind of thing that might happen when a vendor withdraws their on-premises solution and converts to only cloud-based solutions. An organization might start out with a solid industry-leading antivirus solution that they use organization-wide, even though they have separate deployments for their corporate, their low impact, and their medium impact systems. But then the vendor of this leading system basically withdraws the on-premises version of their product, forcing the customer to make a change. And this might actually have a positive impact on corporate and low impact because they have the option of using cloud-based solutions. So a state-of-the-art cloud-based EDR solution can be implemented, but the medium impact or high impact BES Cyber Assets are relegated to use a older, more generic on-premise available antivirus. So that means that their security solution is not as good for the assets that need the most protection as what's being used for low impact BES Cyber Assets and the corporate environment. Next slide. So the problem is that facing the NERC CIP compliance community right now is that the NERC standards process is too slow and cannot fix this problem soon enough. The problems are here now. Existing solutions are being removed and new solutions, and there are new solutions that are only available as cloud services. The NERC standards take years to develop, especially if the standards involve a new technology. And then even with new standards available, there are obstacles to adoption of these new standards when they become available. The compliance risk is at least perceived to be high. Entities don't want to be the first one to implement new standards. And if you choose not to wait and be an early adopter, the compliance effort is higher than if you take your time and wait to see what is accepted before you adopt. Thank you very much. That's my section of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Peter. And don't go too far. I imagine there's, if we get to some questions and we have some time for it, I think we will bring you right back out. Just if you can take 30 seconds, I know people can go and see this publicly, but can you describe, since I took the time and kind of highlighted that all entities are not the same, and the C tag is comprised of a whole bunch of different entity types. Invenergy, what types of assets do you own and operate?
We operate only low impact generation facilities. So we operate mostly renewable, but some thermal generation facilities, but all of them are low impact. Renewables, battery storage as well, solar and wind. But we have a medium impact control center or control centers.
For sure.
So we expect to have high impact in the future.
Correct.
So we are responsible for both. Most of our facilities are low impact, but we also have medium impact and will eventually have high impact.
And there's a number of organizations that are almost the same type of model where they're in renewables and the individual facilities and assets are low. They may have some that have enough output that they meet a medium, but when you aggregate those things under a control model, you move into a medium or a high. So definitely the perspectives provided here from Peter align with what a lot of organizations are facing when they look at this problem. But one other item that I would just call out on Peter's behalf is Invenergy also has assets around the globe. So when they're looking at how they do business in other parts of the world, and then they look at how they do business here in North America, there's a number of companies that are kind of in that world where they do things a certain way for their assets in UK or in Asia Pac or in Europe. But when they come and they look at North America, they really, really have to start becoming CIP experts and dial in how they're going to run and how they're going to operate their business differently here than they do everywhere else with similar assets. And Peter's organization definitely has that same kind of broader than North America presence. And a number of companies are kind of looking at North America and NERC and CIP and trying to figure out how do we do what we do everywhere else and still comply. So thanks again, Peter.
Thank you.
Depending on what questions come up, I may shoot some your way while Luke is busy talking. So Luke, I'm going to move on to the next slide, and then just same question for you. Kind of, could you describe in 30 seconds or less the MISO perspective of the world, kind of asset types and impact levels from a CIP perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. So MISO is a regional transmission organization. So as an RTO, all of our assets are high impact. We serve as the balancing authority and the reliability coordinator for our footprint, which stretches from kind of the middle of the United States, from the Gulf Coast all the way up through Manitoba, Canada. So we have a very large footprint, very kind of geographically wide as far as the kind of weather and everything else that we encounter. But yeah, all of our assets here are high impact. So we're high impact, top to bottom, anything in scope for CIP.
That's great. And it's always rough for me whenever I talk about MISO in classes or when I'm introducing somebody. I've always known them as the Midwest Invented System Operator from way back. And then as you moved up into Canada and you moved down into the South and now you're mid-continent. So I started referring to you as Middle Earth Independent System Operator. But
Yeah.
I'll move to the next slide and let you take over. Thanks, Luke.
Great. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, as kind of mentioned there at the beginning, all of our assets are high impact here at MISO that are in scope for NERC CIP. So we're finding, similar to Tim, that many of our solutions now, particularly in our EACMS space and our SIM monitoring space, are moving to SaaS offerings, either the best version or the cheapest in some cases, or the most capable versions. Or in some cases, we have some vendors that are going to discontinue their on-prem solutions, which then require us to kind of scramble and figure out how we're going to meet those needs for compliance and for our own monitoring within those confines. So our big challenge right now that we're running into is the trend, right? The industry is moving towards cloud-based solutions, and we find ourselves oftentimes kind of left looking at that those things that still can run on-prem to meet our NERC CIP requirements. I think next slide. So one of our areas of concern at the moment is our second factor authenticator. And multi-factor authentication is required in the NERC CIP standards for controlling interactive remote access sessions through an intermediate system. And with that system, right now we're really limited. We can only do a couple different options that are on-prem, and it excludes a lot of the more modern capabilities such as push MFA, text, and some of the other methods that people are using more broadly, and that MISO and others use outside of the NERC CIP space. So with that, we look at it kind of from a risk perspective as well. The second factor authenticator doesn't provide authorization. It's really just part of the authentication chain. It doesn't delineate what you can get access to as far as like role-based access or deriving what resources you can reach. It really is just focused on saying that, yep, we have an extra degree of confidence this user really is this user. It's not just a single password that's been compromised. So we start to look at it from a risk perspective. This is a little bit lower risk than the actual part of the system that provides that authorization beyond just authentication. And there are ways with many of the solutions to manage unavailability. And some concern with cloud solutions is they're off-prem, so there's an exposure there to other infrastructure or other parts of the internet or private links or what have you to connect to some of these solutions. So when we look at it, there are ways to kind of provide a resilient solution while still leveraging a lot of the advantages of the second factor authentication. In many of the on-prem solutions, you have to use like, something like a grid card, or you have to issue tokens and manage tokens for every single user, which inevitably run out of battery when they're on call. And so being able to leverage more modern solutions and use devices that many users already have is something that would be a huge advantage for us in particular as we look at how we can make our workforce more capable and be able to have better metrics and reporting and those types of things out of those systems. So next slide. And with that, as we look at kind of the broader risk of compliance and around some of these cloud solutions, we would like, as we look at things, we're hoping that some of the future cloud adoption standards will start to accept some of the more common frameworks that cloud companies are already compliant to, whether it's FedRAMP or some of the other ISO certifications. And then on top of that, you overlay the NERC compliance requirements. So NERC compliance still is very focused on a lot of areas of user authentication, user security, system security, how you've configured your solution, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, to be secure and to be managed well. And you could look at kind of the foundational layers of cloud, and I think it's time for a lot of us to start shifting our thinking away from, that cloud is some very dangerous thing. As Peter mentioned earlier, cloud's been around for a long time. The areas are very mature now. We're able to get really good metrics and work with providers on their availability and how we would plan our resiliency and security around those scenarios where they may be unavailable, whether it's because you're reaching those services through the internet or you've established private links to some of the cloud providers. Those are also options that are available. And much like today, there's kind of an implicit trust around your Windows operating system or your Red Hat Linux. We would like to start to see kind of the foundational layers of those cloud providers be accepted as, if you meet these certain requirements, and similar to how we trust those operating systems, we're going to trust that that cloud provider is a secure and safe, if you will, place to run certain workloads. So next slide. And certainly for us, the biggest desire, that with that, as MISO looks across the landscape, and me personally, of course, everything I say is Luke's point of view and opinion, is that the desire isn't necessarily to go all in immediately and start running our generation dispatch workloads and those types of things out of the cloud. It's more, we would like to have those options available to us. They're having pathways for MISO and other entities that are subject to NERC CIP to be able to decide kind of what is the best option for them. What can we engineer that meets our reliability and resiliency requirements and our security requirements, but also provides us the best value back, whether that's through capabilities, through direct cost, all those factors, especially when we start looking at now, as the vendor landscape continues to narrow for on-prem solutions, those few remaining kind of know it, and pricing can definitely be less competitive for some of those solutions if they're the only one left standing. And being able for us to leverage multiple vendors and have them kind of competing for our business definitely helps our rates and the rates that then trickle down to our members and ultimately to the ratepayer. So that's one of our other areas that we're really interested in is getting updates to the standards or finding pathways within the current standards that can open up some of that optionality where we're able to then select the best vendor for us based on all those different factors. And next slide. All right, so this is just going to be a really quick run through of kind of how cloud MFA works for those that are a little less familiar, or where we can kind of delineate where the risk areas are. So when you're talking to like a NERC CIP intermediate system, kind of your first factor, you typically are your Windows credentials, Active Directory credentials, if you're an Active Directory environment. So the first thing you'll do, your intermediate system will take those credentials, send it to your on-premise Active Directory, and we'll go to the next one. There we go. And that provides that authentication response. So is this user providing the right username and password, as well as typically your authorization information. So that might be like derived through Active Directory group membership, and that'll tell the intermediate system what resources you may be able to access beyond the intermediate system within the CIP environment. So the second factor typically just needs your user account name. It's going to take your username from the system, and you may be chaining an on-prem Radius server to that, and then from there, that username will get passed from the on-prem Radius server up through, sometimes you use a proxy, depends on your solution, through the internet, typically to a SaaS MFA provider. That provider will then kick off its multi-factor authentication sequence, which typically, in many cases, a push notification, or it might be a verified push, depending on which technology and which features you're using. It'll often go to a smartphone, an app in a smartphone, where we have a lot of control and visibility into what kind of device is being used, where it is, what security it has applied to it. All those factors that really help us understand that the user is using a device that's been approved, and we can do some controls there too on the security of that device and those types of things to ensure that it's well secured. And then once the user says, "Yep, it's me. I expected this response," it goes back. The MFA response goes back to the SaaS provider, and then the kind of accept or reject comes back down through the internet, back through your proxy to your RAID server, that then kicks it over the final result to your intermediate system. And then it can decide, yes, we've verified through multi-factor this user is who they say they are. And then from there, the intermediate system then will determine what resources you have permissions to reach based on that authorization information received from Active Directory. So again, as we kind of look at how this works within the realm of NERC CIP, there is definitely a conversation around about where the SaaS MFA provider sits. Is it an EACMS or not? Is it part of the authentication chain? Right now, the guidance has kind of been leaning toward yes, it is. But as we look at kind of the risk involved in there, there isn't kind of the same level of risk. It's not sending back permissions. It's not sending back some of that other information. It's really just acting as that second factor authenticator. So we're hopeful that we'll find a path either within the current requirements or with some type of hopefully minor tweaks to let us start to use solutions like this that are fairly low risk as far as what you can actually do with them, and can really enhance our ability to be more flexible with what solutions we choose and the way in which we provide that second factor authentication experience for our users. So I think that concludes my section right now.
Yes, don't go anywhere. So and Peter, if you want to turn back on your video and your mic, I appreciate. So first, thank you both. We have about 10 minutes left for questions. We don't have to consume the entire 10 minutes. But if anybody who is out there has questions, if you want to use the Zoom Q&A, that would be great. I will try to be a filter and work through that. But just a couple of things that have come up along the way, and I'll pose a question. You can both sort of think about it while I talk. We, amongst ourselves, as we are in webinar 2, and we've sort of covered some of this in webinar 1, but really it's going to get a deep dive in webinar 5 when we get into kind of the current compliance challenges. That is something that, as we looked across this webinar series, we really wanted to hear from the entities first, then from the solution providers, where we're seeing a move towards cloud-based only for some solution providers, and on-prem is going away. So this is a emerging problem that we wanted to hear from the solution providers right after the entities. Then as we start to move into the entities can't solve this problem alone, so we need to hear from the cloud service providers. And then in webinar 5, we kind of talk about the deep dive of what are the challenges? Why can't we do SIP in the cloud today? And that's something that struck me as Peter was talking and as Luke was talking. If you're new to this space and you've joined this webinar and you're interested in cloud and you're interested in industrial controls, and kind of the full employment act of NERC CIP of none of us have enough people, we need to hire much, much more from a NERC CIP perspective. So you're interested in this space. You've heard us all say, just as a matter of fact, that, well, we can't do this in the cloud now, and the standards take too long to change. So Peter and Luke, while I'm still drawing on this long intro, if you could think of just 1 or 2 examples for now of why you can't do what you want to do in the cloud. Again, a promise, this is going to be a deep dive in webinar 5. I know the topics they're going to cover there. We can't even fit all of the reasons this is a challenge currently in one single webinar. But for people who this is the first thing you've heard, Peter or Luke, do you have an example, something that is a challenge that we are unable to do this way in the cloud today, and it's going to take standards changes, interpretations, glossary of terms changes, or a practice guide development in order to overcome some of those hurdles?
I think a real simple one is the CIP 7 requirements to apply or at least consider applying security patches. And I think it's a good example of it probably happens better in the cloud than if, at least unless maybe I shouldn't say better, but it's easier if the cloud does it for us than if we as an organization and our IT group has to do it. I think it's less likely that patches will be missed. It's more likely, since the cloud provider is providing the service, they probably have a better idea of the security patches because they developed them that need to be applied, except of course for the underlying operating system patches and things like that. And while it's not absolutely impossible for us to do that in the cloud, it's not, since we have to document and show compliance and show that the patches have been applied, it's effectively impossible to do that. The cloud vendor would have to give us some kind of report, and whether or not the auditors would accept that, is kind of an open question.
Sure.
So that's an example.
And
Yeah, I think for us, the big challenges are also CIP 10, configuration management, and change management around those things. When you have a cloud provider, they're frequently doing changes to kind of the undercloud, the underlay layer that you don't really see as the consumer. They're doing things underneath the hood that you really have no awareness of. You probably don't want to know. It's going to be pretty noisy. That's what you're paying them for, is to do all that for you. So finding that kind of doing configuration management exactly the way that CIP 10 delineates is pretty challenging when it's cloud provided, as well as some of the physical access control is the other one that's pretty difficult for us. So obviously, when you're in the cloud, you're in someone else's data center, they're not going to give you a term list of every person that could or could not have access to that data center. A lot of times those data centers are outsourced again from the cloud provider to some other data center provider company. So you end up with this kind of long chain of physical access difficulty based on the way the standards are written today. So both physical and logical access and kind of those underlay layers within the cloud provider that, again, you don't see as the customer are pretty challenging that we found for us to make them compliant. We've had to make some decisions already around some of our other solutions and have them re-engineered or engineered in ways that put a lot more burden on MISO. Just because of that, we couldn't get the remote or support staff list. They might have 10,000 people potentially, right, who can access or work in that system in some way. They're not going to give you those lists, and it's impossible for us to maintain them. So that's another area that we've had some challenges.
For sure. I think those are both great examples. I hope it helps some people who might have just been joining, and you're hearing us already talking like this is a challenge and something needs to change in order for us to overcome it. I just wanted to provide some data points or some perspectives on, so you can start thinking about those challenges. I think for people who are new and they're starting to digest the standards, there's not a lot of reading that needs to be done to just read through all the standards, and they seem pretty straightforward. The projects of becoming CIP compliant are significantly easier than the processes of doing CIP on a daily, minute to minute, hour to hour, and kind of a programmatic perspective. And that's really where a lot of the challenges come up in regards to how you need to comply and what your programs need to look like. And that in general is not business as usual for some solution providers and cloud service providers in regards to the types of information or the way they perform tasks that they wouldn't simply just provide to all of their customers to support them during an audit. Nor do they just automatically magically align with what you're actually required to do. So again, just we started with the entity perspective because the entity owns this. This isn't something that, like, when you're looking at risk, you can manage it, you can accept it, you can transfer it. This isn't something that they can just transfer this. Meaning, even if you decide as a program, as an entity, to integrate cloud, it's for the purpose of reliability, it's for the purpose of cybersecurity, it's for the purpose of kind of the benefits that you can gain, which may or may not include compliance, but that's the entity's decision. And then they own it and have to defend it. They can't just transfer this risk to a cloud provider and say, now you're going to get audited, because the cloud provider isn't. They're not a NERC registered entity. They're not going to get audited every 3 years. I hope that helped people who are listening. With the 5 minutes we have left, I have 2 questions. One is sort of, Luke, your perspective on, do you have the same challenges? So it's a question specifically to the MFA and kind of the remote access, interactive remote access question. Would the use of a soft token, multi-factor authentication, be seen as running afoul of the standard as well?
Yeah, I don't think so. If you're just using kind of the rotating code soft token on a phone, just because that's isolated just to the phone, but the number you put in when you type that number in stays on-prem. It's going to go between your machine, your laptop, when you type it in the window, to the intermediate system that'll then forward that challenge response onto your Radius server, and it'll reply back with a yes or no. So yeah, that wouldn't, I don't think, fall under be run afoul of the standard the way it's written today. Agreed.
All right. Last question for both of you, but maybe more for Peter, if you want to try to tackle it, and maybe we could jointly tackle it. But it's a general question in regards to a comment and a general feel, even if you were in the CTAG meeting and you were sort of participating, which again, it is invite only, but if there's somebody who's very interested in joining that, please feel free to reach out, and we can pass that on to Lou and Chris for consideration. But as you listen to our conversations, we tend to focus more on the high and medium discussions of SIP and cloud. In general, as we talk about low and we talk about the requirements unique to low, there's a while every program is different and there's not one right way to be compliant, there's much, much less concern about SIP and cloud if you're a low. The question that came up was specifically, so when you see the low requirements for physical security protections and perimeters, how are people kind of addressing that now with low programs? So they get it from an electronic perimeter perspective. They get it from we have to do quarterly awareness training. We have to have an incident response plan. We need transient cyber asset removable media management. So we get the universe of low. But when we're talking about physical security protections of the cyber assets, how are you handling that for low? And is it doable with cloud? I have a response to that, but I'd like to open it up to Peter and Luke if you have comments as well.
So for low impact, let's see. So the way Invenergy handles it is in some ways, in many ways, the same as we do for medium. We use the same types of controls, even though, there's no specific controls that are required for low impact. So you don't have to use key cards. You don't have to log access. Many of the requirements that you have for medium and high impact don't apply. You have to have a security plan, but we tend to model that security plan for low impact facilities along the lines of the medium impact requirements. Now, that being said, we could use a cloud-based PACS to do those things, but we don't want to have separate systems for our low impact and our medium impact. That's 2 systems to manage. So certainly there's, if you're strictly low impact, and with a new BCSI, well, actually, even without that, if you're strictly low impact, the cloud isn't really an impediment at this point.
That's great. And Luke, I can give you a pass if you want, since everything you have is high. Any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I don't think I had anything to add there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, one of the comments that I added, so first was kicking the can down the road to say, webinar 4 will be cloud service providers coming in and talking about how they're working with customers right now in this space. So some of them are low only, and they've moved into this world. And what these cloud service providers are providing as documentation or evidence or attestations of what they're doing for their physical security controls. So we'll hear from them in webinar 4, and we will ask specifically kind of how they do that and share that information with entities who are going through audits and facing some of the same questions. where they need to demonstrate how they meet strict compliance with the requirements of CIP 003 for their low programs. But again, just for a quick answer here, I believe this is an area for lows where you would be relying on kind of that documentation of evidence and supporting details for how that is provided and how those protections are delivered if you were to move into a cloud service provider model for your low impact assets. We are right on time, which is very rare for me. I'm usually 5 to 10 minutes over on just about every webinar that I'm involved in. We have addressed any of the Q&As that were out there and open. So any follow-on questions, feel free to email direct or contact us. But I would like to thank our two speakers, Luke and Peter. Really, really appreciate you starting to move us down this sort of 4-perspective path. Again, for those who are interested, next, our webinar 3 is going to be our solution providers and application provider perspective. And then we will move into webinar 4, which is cloud service providers, and then a discussion specifically around deep dive into the exact kind of compliance challenges and speed bumps that we have for high and medium programs, and sort of hear all of those views so we can come into webinar 6 with the perspective of what do we do as an industry. We can't wait for kind of guidance. We need to pursue some implementations in some ways, and really kind of how do we move forward here with webinar 6. I will comment that while we love the concept of a 6-pack, the CTAG has been talking about a potential dedicated webinar that is just CIP and cloud and low impact assets. So some input from people who are living that life now and their perspectives. We may someday see a webinar 7, but right now these are the ones that are currently planned. The registrations for all the remaining will open up very shortly with the speakers announced and the titles and abstracts delivered. Thanks again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. And Luke and Peter, great job today. I appreciate it. Bye all.